Welcome back, everybody, to your daily update on the state of the Malazan Empire. And we're finishing Dust of Dreams Book 2 today because I just finished reading it. And now that my splitting headache has somewhat abated, I feel I can actually talk about it. We'll see how this goes. Um, Also, the mead thing is coming together. I have almost all ingredients here, so I'll try to record it on Sunday, weather permitting, because I'd like to do it outside because, of it being kind of messy, because dealing with tons of honey is always sticky. But yeah, it's been raining today, so that's not like an option. Also, I got my first hate comment, so I feel like a proper YouTuber now. It ended up in spam, so that's why it isn't visible anywhere. But I mean, I don't feel obliged to manually agree to posting hate comments on my videos. If they, show up, then I'll totally, go with it, but or think again about it. But that's a different situation. Anyway, uh, complaining about me drinking beer on my channel seems like one of those really dumb things to do. But apart from that, let's go and talk about Dust of Dreams. Cheers. All right. So, obviously, things end brutally badly. But we already knew that because that's how Malazan deals with a lot of stuff. So I figured what we'll do is we will look at the other stuff first, which is obviously chapter 11. Once again, it's an odd chapter, so that's Malazans and Letheri. And we have a lot of interesting stuff going on there as well, right? So first we begin with that like slightly comedic situation, like interaction between Tehol and the Akrenai ambassador about that piece of art. And see, there's a lot of like valuable things about cultural or like political interactions, diplomatic interactions, that I feel, makes sense to look at. So first of all, we have that I don't want to say arrogance or cultural arrogance that a lot of us have, with Tehol and Bug and Janath trying to actually understand what the thing is they were given. Um, and desperately trying to invent a use for it, thinking that it's useful. Now, this is something that reminds me of that old archaeology issue, that like everything that you can't like actually figure out what it is was usually labeled as has ritual purpose, because that's like the catch-all phrase or catch-all definition in archaeology is ritual purpose, and you just like assume there's some kind of ritual, and then that's good. But yeah, this kind of arrogance in there is that they believe there has to be some use in there. They'll just, because the Akronai are perceived as these nomads, which might just be, you know, less civilized in a way. So there's that. Then when the Akron ambassador shows up, he's first of all, he's delightfully rude. Well, that's a different thing. Like, the point is, he's like, no, it doesn't have to have any use. It's just a useless piece of art. That's like the point, because we have to exchange useless gifts because of some old tradition and so forth. And showing up that arrogance because they just didn't know that that's sort of the idea there. He also obviously the way he describes the idea of like asking for help, how that will usually result in either saying nothing or all of that stuff. Like the way he describes those diplomatic relationships between Lether and Akron are like, that's just done. It's a very how to say, um apt description of how empires or like large world powers usually do their diplomacy. It's like either they don't help smaller countries or they help smaller countries in situations, but only out of their own interest, which usually means, you know, gaining more power or wealth, whether that's like grassland, prime grassland, or whether that's like oil concessions. Doesn't really matter in the end. It just shows that there's always self-interest, and altruism is not something that happens in diplomacy. But then, and this is like the clever bit there, I feel, the end, when it all comes around and Tehol is like, yeah, we probably won't help you, but as a gift, I'll give you, those wagons full of silks, iron, and so forth, like actually useful stuff. And he thinks that's a good idea. And then Janath actually explains to him that that, on the other hand, will actually be worse for that for the scepter in this case, the ruler of the Akrenai, because it basically means that he has to now spread this wealth and so forth, you know, among his followers, and it will actually mean more like problems because he has to adapt or change or actually use it in his like customs or in the way their power structure is built. That is yeah, that it's in the end it's not the useful gift that Tehol thought. Which, once again shows up this arrogance, this cultural arrogance that we have to deal with. And also, also just showing that how difficult actual diplomacy is, and why we might actually have trained diplomats and not just, nice people figuring shit out. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight this one because it is once again one of those instances where the Malazan Book of the Fallen shows us a lot of interesting things about real world politics, real world history, and so forth. And yeah, we'll see that even someone as well-meaning as Tehol might, while trying to be well-meaning, actually do some damage, because once again, and it's something that harkens back to what we spoke about yesterday, intentions don't matter that much when it comes to the actual results. We may find those more like, understandable, but that doesn't, change anything about the results. Whether that's by accident killing half an island's population because some of the stuff you gave them was contaminated with some sickness they die of, or that is destabilizing the power structure in that country because you give something that you think is useful, but actually, destabilize their power structure. In the end, intent is one thing, but results are an entirely different thing. So yeah, there's that bit to talk about. All right, what else was interesting there? We see how, oh yeah, obviously we have that meeting between the court of Letheras and the adjunct and Lostara Yil. And I feel that one is also really important for a bunch of reasons. One of them is we have that scene beforehand when they're talking, when Lostara and the adjunct are standing outside looking at the standards and all these like captured parts of captured bits of the suppressed and conquered people. And we on the one hand say that yes, of course, the idea of empire will always be to expand and batter down its neighbors. That's just how empire works, which is also how the Malazan Empire worked. Now, has the Malazan Empire been kinder to the conquered places or not? That's a question up for debate, because obviously we already knew that they also bring help by eliminating corruption, improving trade, and all that shit. But it still means that local cultures get swallowed up and changed irrevocably. Irrevocably? Fucking words. Irrevocably. That's the word I was looking for. So yeah, there's that. But we also see that the adjunct has a very, very clear idea. And this is something I feel like the first time we have that, because we know that Tavare is not talking much. We knew that before, but what we see here is that in those few things she says to Lostara Yill about the situation in the army, is that she has a pretty good idea where the army stands, with her idea that yes, she's giving them this chaos now so they will like understand how to behave later on and all of these things. So there's that. But we then have that goodbye scene when the adjunct gets that knife from Bug, male. We don't exactly know yet what it is for, but on the other hand, we can guess what with all the other stuff going on and him mentioning blood. We also, we will see what comes of that in the future. But yeah, this is just a foreshadowing for something that we will have to talk about in the future. But what I wanted to look at for a moment is the ending of that scene once the adjunct and Lostara Yill have left. And that is... Oh yeah, first quick thing. It's also interesting to see that... no, I'll go into that later on. But what I wanted to talk about here is the ending of that scene when Tehol, in his usual theatrical way, composed that scene. And this is like one of those situations where we're getting very, very close to that fourth wall. Because it almost seems like how Tehol is composing all of that. He's aware that this is all for an audience, for some outside audience, whoever that is. It might also just be him. The audience may just be him and him enjoying that kind of thing. But the way he's like, yeah, we need it this way, and this way. And then in the end, like, we need a court artist. And this is like funny on the outside, but it also shows us that obviously in all kinds of stories we read in a lot of media, but also like in... I guess most of us are aware of that, but of course, like all kinds of like parts of real world politics are choreographed. It's vitally important. That's why you have protocol and all this other stuff. Like you set up these the things, like you set up the presentation of politics. Politics in general is to a large part also performance, because you perform for the people that you rule over, in a way. And this just makes this part very clear. Right, but what I wanted to talk about as well was the bit, first of all, with Lostara Yill and the knife, that the adjunct is aware of Lostara Yill's obsession with the knife, which we know already, that this is like her way of dealing with the trauma of Pearl's death, which you remember she had to kill to avoid, to cut short the effects of the poison that he was killed with. But we also have that like conversation, because there's so much going on in that dialogue about fate and about how fate ends all these things, and fate doesn't care what people do or don't, and it's not about justice. Fate doesn't care, which also means that it kind of takes away at least part of the blame, in a way that we as survivors of things feel. And the way the adjunct basically talks about the death of Tamber, but she also at the same time talks about the death of Pearl. And Lostara Yill completely fails to understand that. It's so tragic, because so often in life we also fail to understand these things. And it's so often we talk about one thing while also meaning another thing, and then our opposing side just like completely doesn't get that. So I felt that was a very interesting aspect. And once again, the idea that yes, fate is, as they say, blind, and that also means that it does take away all those like meaning meanings we put onto all kinds of events. Those are not exact, those aren't there. They are just wiped away by what you might call fate, or just like the universe fucking with us, basically. Random chance, whatever you want to call it. And that's another thing that I feel is important in there. So yeah, quite a few things going on in Letheras. um then another thing that I wanted to look at was, I'm not gonna go too deeply into the whole captains figuring out that Blistig is not doing anything, and how the sergeants and all of that, how the army is basically working around Blisdig in a way. I'm not going to go into that yet. I feel it makes more sense to look at the whole thing once more things have happened. Although, and you know, it's still like the army trying to pull itself together, from, in this case, the bottom up, I guess. No, I wanted to look at the idea of Hedge and the bridge burners. That conversation that Hedge has with Buttle, and when he's like, "Yeah, the filler told me to move on and start something new," and he then tried and all of that, and then he figured out that no, he's not done. He's still a bridge burner, and this is something really important, I feel. Now, apart from all the like special thing about Hedge dying and coming back and so forth, there's a lot of people that will always tell us, and you know, on the one hand, there's like Sunrise, Sergeant Sunrise. You remember we spoke about that yesterday for a second, but yeah, Sergeant Sunrise, who wants to start new, and there's a lot of reasons why we want to start new, or start anew, or restart in a different way our lives. There's a lot of reasons of that, for that. And a lot of times we do that. I've tried a bunch of times, trying to be someone that maybe I'm fundamentally not. And this is the important bit there. That Hedge has figured out who he is, and has realized that yes, he's a sapper. He's an old school sapper, and he's a bridge burner, and nothing more. Right? Fiddler is no longer that. Fiddler has moved on. He's a sergeant. He still has those skills, but that's not the point. In his head, in his personality, Fiddler has moved on considerably. A Hedge hasn't. And knowing who you really are, and accepting that, there's a kind of acceptance in there when you realize that, yeah, maybe that's just the thing you are, and that's the thing you're really good at. Then accepting that there's some kind of power that comes from actually accepting that, and it might also just make you slightly more happy in the end. It's sort of what I figured at this point, for my own life, but we're not going to go too deeply into that yet. Anyway, that's kind of the thing that I wanted to point out there. Yeah, I feel that's sort of the most interesting things that I just can remember from like chapter 11 today. Maybe I've missed something. As I said, I've spent an entire day fighting off a brutal headache. So now let's look at chapter 12, where once again Steven Erikson doesn't pull any punches and just knocks us square in the face, because guess what? Onos Tulan dies again. Or maybe dies for the first time, depending on how you see that whole ritual of Telan kind of thing going on. But yeah, he gets killed / kills himself at the end because of stupidity, which, you know, is sort of another through line of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. A lot of tragedies could be averted if we as people would just be slightly more compassionate, slightly more, slightly smarter, slightly more willing to actually take in our environment and think about what we do. But first of all, I wanted to look at the metaphor of that hunt thing. So there's a bunch of things at the beginning when they come to that cliff that was used for hunting by the Imas. And you have that scene, and he shows up there, and he gets challenged again by one of those, one of the Borgast. And you have first of all, we have Steven Erickson pulling out all the stops and talking about prehistoric meat curing and all that stuff, and hunting tactics, something where all the archaeological knowledge gets pulled out. Yes, of course, humans have hunted like that. You drive the herd over a cliff, and then you just take them apart and process the meat. We see that just described in pretty accurate detail, as far as I can tell, where you have like the pit with all the bones, and on the side you have the hearth, and you have those holes where the meat is cured and all that shit, right? This is like very exact what you might read at least in a pop science book about archaeology. Probably better than most of those, but it's interesting to see that, right? But then we come to the larger image that's also in there. The idea that there's always a way around that, Tool uses when he walks down that cliff, but most of the time, and that's like the bit there, is like the herds that were driven, they, because of their fear, didn't look around, just ran straight into the cliff, like over the cliff, basically. And now we come to all these different layers. This obviously can be seen as a metaphor for the Bargas that are running straight towards their annihilation, at least in Tool's view. We'll see where that goes, but he already knows that the enemy they're facing is something they can't beat. They need to find a way around that. Because of their fear and their anger, and I guess that's the other thing, like their rage and their need to fight an enemy. They're somewhat blinded to the alternatives, and that need to fight is oftentimes rooted in like a very deep fear of the foreign, of the other, and all these other things. So they're driven basically towards their annihilation because of fear, or like how their emotions blind them to the alternatives, which is just the second layer. Because the third layer, when we come back to that whole idea of extinction, and this is also tied in there because we also have this point where he describes that this way of hunting was part of the overhunting that almost killed the Imas, or at least pushed them into the ritual of Telan, because they overhunted, and then the herds didn't come, and people died because the herds didn't come, because they killed too many before. Now you tie that together with the idea of where the Barghast are heading, which is the Barghast are heading toward to their annihilation. And then once again you put those two images together and realize this is where we as humanity are headed towards as well, right? Because of overusing the planet, we are heading straight towards annihilation, that cliff. And as we already know, the cliff doesn't care. And because this is obviously not just a pronunciation of our inevitable demise as a species, there is, this is the good part, there is a way around if we actually stop and think and realize. So I wanted to look at that as a very powerful image within the story before we get to the next part. And that next part obviously is them arriving at the destruction of the Snake Hunter clan, which is like total destruction. And first of all, they try to deny that something unnatural happened there, like, oh, it was an earthquake and so forth. And Tool trying to, that whole power struggle thing happens again, and this time he actually has to pull out his sword and prove in that way that he really abhors, and we know why, that he is stronger. He has to actually prove in combat. We already knew about all that whole like challenge situation from way back in Memories of Ice, but the point is, he has to prove that, and he shows his superiority. And this is like the sad bit. There's like the rest of the people only listen to him once he actually, I don't want to say stoops to their level, but basically that's what it is, and does that, like uses those traditions and rituals. And that's when they realize it. That's when they finally accept his actual leadership. And then, because of bad luck, he gets killed. It's like he finally convinces them that yes, they cannot cannot fight what is coming there. We still not really know what it is, I guess. So I don't want to say it yet, because I don't want to spoil it yet to anyone. But yeah, there is something very powerful coming. And I guess we already know that it is connected to those thunderstorms, storm clouds with hail and shit like that. But yeah, not gonna go there yet. But my point is, there is something in there. There's a force they can't fight. They need to actually retreat, change their ways far enough, change their ways enough to actually survive. Because yes, changing your way to survive is the point, which we just spoke about before when we talk about that cliff. And he finally convinces them, but unfortunately, the Baran Barghast march past him by sheer fucking accident. We once again, the whole idea of fate, find him, and he decides to actually. And this is like once again that responsibility thing that he has. It's like the message that he finally managed to pound into his people, into those 100 people who you remember were his like fiercest critics that really hated him, but he has managed to convince them of the truth. And if they just, which is once again their reflex, if they would actually, just stand up and fight against those how many thousand other Barghast, well, then the knowledge of that thing would fail, die with them, and the Barghast, all of them, would die anyway. So he decides that they need to kill him to avoid that overall slaughter, because and they almost don't do it, so he has to very much help it along. And so there is still some kind of hope for him, but still, Onos Tulan is dead. And someone is really not happy about that. That's Olar Ethil, as we find out later on. In that situation, when Torrent runs into her by accident, or maybe not by accident. Now, we already knew that Olar Ethil is apparently another elder god. What else she is or may not be is a whole other discussion. We might talk about that later on. But here's the point. Apparently she has some kind of hold on Talanimas, or at least on Onos Tulan and the Barghast, which has now been destroyed. But she says she's not yet done with him, so we'll see how that goes. But she now hooks up with Torrent. And we also see where that goes. Yeah. But let's now go to the other big revelation, the end of the Road of Galan. We finally learned that it is the Road of Galan because of Blind Galan, who I think has been mentioned before. And it actually leads to Carcanas, that mythical first city of the Tist Andi, which is obviously in ruins. And yeah, we'll see how all of that ends. I mean, there's not much more than just the revelation that they ended up in Carcanas. Now, the question is, wasn't Carcanas in the Hold of Darkness? Shouldn't that be like, and wasn't like, are they now in Corellid Galen, actually? I'm not quite sure. I mean, yeah, they have to be, right? Which still, begs the questions like, where the fuck did Mother Dark go when she turned away? Did Mother Dark just leave Corellid Galen? That's some kind of world building questions that I'm not qualified to answer, is what I'm trying to say here. Yeah. But yeah, that's the final thing I wanted to look at is the situation with Setchulath and the Errand and Kalmandaras. And the idea that obviously the errand has not moved on when he then heals Setchulath and tries to actually force him to do things. Um, and he basically heals him or makes him young again by giving him power, and completely doesn't understand that Setch has moved on and is actually pretty happy that he has left behind that role of Lord of Misfortune, which I guess puts him in a similar spot as Hood in a way. We spoke about that yesterday, with him basically, how to say, embodying a function of nature, and a rather unhappy one in this case, because obviously it's misfortune, which just happens. He's not like the errant nudging things. I guess he's more like the embodiment of shit happens. And apparently he was rather happy with the fact of no longer being that and having, moved that, handed on that responsibility to Opon. So the whole situation of him giving him that power, and like of the errant giving Setchulath the power, and Setch basically not wanting that and pushing it back, declining that gift, and that being seen as an insult by Erastus, is, I feel, it can be seen as another one of these how to say, the idea of declining gifts that are given with that are like unwanted or unasked for, and are given with some kind of intent behind it. Because obviously the errant doesn't just do that because he's a nice dude. I think we've all figured out by now that he's not a nice dude. And still, because I guess he's also still in that whole like mindset of exchange that we have spoken about so many times. And we have that, and it really insults us a lot, when we give something and we are pushed back. It really insults us a lot. So I guess the what I'm trying to say here is that, apart from being sympathetic to Setchulath, which I certainly am, we should also ask ourselves, would we actually react differently from the errand in that situation? And I fear far fewer of us would actually react differently than we might actually hope. And with these cheerful words, I'm going to leave you for today. We're going to probably start with book 3 tomorrow. And until then, have a great Thursday. Cheers.